Yes. Ready to do.
I think, actually, if you sit in the chair, you'll topple over backwards. This situation, I guess maybe we can flip you like right here. Maybe up around the cable. Yeah, that should work.
Okay. Sorry.
Do you moderate often?
I've been doing it more, like as we get closer to the election season. Like this is my third one this season. I was supposed to have one next week, but it got canceled due to the coronavirus.
Oh wait, if you're looking over there, I should go to the other side. So we.
How you doing? As long as my son has food, he's fine. Dad, can I eat?
Is he officially a teenager or is he preteen?
He is official.
Is that a Shirley Chisholm pen? Yes.
I will not obscure that nice pen. You're already good.
Would have worn my Harold Washington.
Thank you. Of course, it gets kind of warm.
I need like cup holders.
You want to run that under your jacket?
Oh, yeah.
No, when you have the like tall ones.
Actually, this. If you fall off, you'll be fine. Just don't get back up, because then they'll know.
I haven't been. Okay.
If the chair's moving, get off.
Okay.
Actually, this goes under your arm. Sorry, this is only my second day working
Sure.
with lab mics.
Oh, no problem.
All right, who belongs here?
Carl Stokes, and I know he's here. I saw him a few minutes ago.
In the back in the green room.
He's fixing his hair. Oh.
Remember, everybody, don't touch your faces. It's very difficult to not touch your face. I guess I don't need my phone.
No, I've been like obsessing. It's been a distraction how much I think about how much I do.
I'm a stress face toucher. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, I realize now how much I do it every day, all day.
Me too.
Get myself the coronavirus. I wish we had little tables to give y'all for your waters. I said, I wish we had little tables so y'all wouldn't have to like bend
Like
over.
a camel pack. We could just have a hose connected to them.
We could wear one of those hats. with the-
I mean,
Oh yeah, he's gonna be out.
Okay. Hey.
all this stuff up here, I feel constricted.
Yeah, I think I would want
Can I put it like up through it? Sure. Do I need to like?
I feel young.
Have all your people dropping, we're gonna have a good time.
That was all your people. You brought the whole squad out the last couple of times.
Wait, is it pointing the
Okay.
wrong
I got
way?
I got a
It's
couple
okay.
good votes out of that crowd. I was looking forward to them.
much larger audience at home to our 2020 Council President Transportation Forum, hosted by Bikemore in Action, Real News Network, Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, and the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition. I'm Lisa Snowden-McCrae. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Beat, and also executive producer here at the Real News Network, and I'll be moderating tonight. Out of an abundance of caution around COVID-19, we are hosting the forum in a closed studio and ask our sold-out studio audience to stay home and watch online. We are thankful to both the candidates and our audience for their flexibility in this last-minute change. Thanks, guys. While it is rarely centered in political discourse in Baltimore City, transportation is the single greatest detriment in social mobility. The relationship is stronger than crime, test scores, or percentage of two-parent homes in community. The deliberate racism in transportation infrastructure planning for automobiles over the past century has served to enable white flight and drive segregation and inequity. We're here tonight to see how candidates for City Council President plan on leading a legislative agenda to tackle this critical issue in our city. In organizing this forum, we set a threshold for participation to ensure that we could make the best use of our limited time tonight. The present candidates met this threshold. After the forum, please visit www.ibikeivote.com, www.ibikeivote.com to read full responses to candidate questionnaires for mayor, council president, comptroller, and city council, as well as comparison and analysis of candidates' transportation positions. Over the next 90 minutes, we will ask the candidates before us a series of questions on transportation developed by organizers and submitted by the general public in advance of the forum. More than half of the questions were sourced from the public. Candidates will have 2 minutes to respond to our first question and 1 minute to respond to all other questions. They will also receive 1 minute for a closing statement. We'll begin alphabetically and move down the line. Joining us tonight are Leon Pinkett, Shannon Sneed, Dan Sparaco, I just asked you about this. Sparaco, and Carl Stokes.
Hi.
Hello. Delegate Nick Mosby planned to attend but had to defend a bill tonight in Annapolis on the floor. With that, let's get started with Leon Pinkett. Okay, for this first question, we're giving you 2 minutes to answer.
Okay.
Describe the power of the council president's office. What exactly is the role now, and why are you seeking it?
Thank you for the question. And for those that are watching, we just ask that you exercise an abundance of care and precaution, especially with the coronavirus. And please, during this time, look out for those who are the most vulnerable in your community. I think this is a time while we might not be able to touch people physically, we can still care for them. And so I think as the council president, our roles are multifaceted. One is that we are responsible for legislating. We're responsible for creating and help initiating the policies as it relates to the city. The policies that align with the goals and aspirations of the public. I really consider the city council as being the people's house and the voice of the people. Within that, although, and I think this is something that the council can do, be more proactive about and take more authority in, is that while we don't form the budget, while the mayor is responsible for creating the budget, the city council does approve the budget. And too often, the budget that we receive from the mayor, even after it's approved by us, still looks so much like the budget that we initially received from the mayor. And as the council president, especially representing areas of our city that I consider to be some of the most disinvested areas when we talk about Penn North and we talk about Sandtown, Winchester, too often I don't see communities like that reflected in the budget in a way that they should be. And we continue to see levels of disinvestment in those communities and expect for them to change. So as council president, it is my goal with the authority that I have to really lead the council in a unified way to really affect the budget in a way that it hasn't been impacted before.
Okay. And do you feel like you've been representing those communities that you mentioned in the capacity that you have right now?
Oh, absolutely. Even to the degree this past budget cycle, I was the only council person to vote against the budget. I refuse to be complicit with a budget that doesn't support communities that have been disinvested in our city.
Okay. All right, we will move on to Shannon Sneed for the next question. What role do you see the council playing in shaping the city transportation system and policy?
I actually see it as a huge role. Right now, we actually have what I consider
expert subject matters in the council, where you have Councilman Ryan Dorsey, who knows transportation, who I consider an expert in transportation, who's been working around policy, around transportation, having access, everyone having access to transportation in Baltimore City, because we currently don't have that. And so that's what I want to see. I want to make sure that a council member like John Bullock, who's in housing, I want to use those, what I consider expert policymakers, and let them kind of lead the pathway on how we make Baltimore City better. When you talk about housing, when you talk about crime, when you talk about transportation, those are all the things that are directly connected to transportation. And so how do you make those, how do you make it better in Baltimore City? By allowing everyone to have access to all those things. We can totally change the dynamic of crime in our neighborhoods if everyone had access to complete public transportation. Right now, it takes 45 minutes for someone to even get to a job outside of downtown. We have to address the needs of Baltimore City residents. And as the city council president, that's what I'm going to be doing.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Dan, let's talk about the changes you'd make to the office. In prior councils, legislation has often been championed by individual council people, and committee assignments by the council president could effectively kill ideas before they had an opportunity to be heard. What would this process look like in your council?
Well, my council would look very different than the current council because I believe there should not be a council president at all. We are the only city that structures a city council with an independently elected leader of that council over whom our city council has no say and no responsibility. So our council president today has essentially 3 jobs. One is to basically hang out and wait to become the mayor, which is what we've just witnessed for the 3rd time of 4 city council presidents have become mayor. The next job they have is to be the boss of a city council. We elect a new city council as we did in 2016, and we had the same council president. And the 3rd job they have is to sit on top of a board of estimates that dominates the contracting process that is so essential to transportation projects. And that board of estimates is a place where our most powerful politicians award contracts to their own campaign donors. All of this needs to change, and the council president is a keystone of the failed system.
Okay. Why should we believe that? Why should we believe that you're going to dissemble this position, or how, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, and I think I've already convinced 2 council members of this idea because they've both, Ryan Dorsey from the 3rd District and Bill Henry from the 4th District, have introduced legislation that would delete the council president from the city council. And by removing this job and letting the council select its own speaker, its own leader, and then removing all the resources dominated by a council president and giving them to the rest of the council, we're empowering our city council. These are the people who are supposed to be a check on the mayor. They can't be today. So in my view, this is a case that I think a lot of people are interested in hearing.
Okay. All right, Carl Stokes.
Yes.
We will end this first part with you. Baltimore has many neighborhoods where over 1/3 of residents of working age aren't in the labor force.
Right.
Of those who do have jobs, many endure commute times 45 minutes or longer one way. Children in neighborhoods with those characteristics are likely to be born into poverty and face long odds of escaping it. What is your legislative agenda to reduce commute time and increase access to jobs for Baltimore's neighborhoods who most lack it?
Right, so I think that the jobs of the president of the city council are twofold. I know that was a previous question, but the first job is to herd cats, otherwise known as the Baltimore City Council. But the second and more important job is to head the Board of Estimates. And I bring that to this question, Lisa, because the current Board of Estimates every week takes in and passes out tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. Almost none of that money goes to Black or minority vendors, contractors. Almost none of that money goes to local contractors or vendors. It goes to companies from out of town who bring other people in, who bring their jobs in with them, and that money goes right back out of town. So the first question about jobs in the city, have to do where the money is going for city works, city contracts. It doesn't happen in Baltimore City. Maybe 2% or less actually goes to minority local businesses. I think that is probably the overwhelming issue for how we do better by giving our people in the Baltimore City a chance and opportunity for jobs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, so for these next few questions, you guys will get a minute until we get to the last question, then it's back to 2 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna go with you again,
Okay.
Mr. Pinkett. In 2018, the city adopted a complete streets ordinance recognized by Smart Growth America as one of the top complete streets projects in the country. What does complete streets mean to you? And do you have a plan to hold the administration accountable on implementation?
Yes, so first and foremost, we've got to fully implement complete streets. It is groundbreaking, the legislation that was introduced, but we've got to make certain that we fully implement it. Complete streets means to me, I guess when you look at it, it's a methodology, it's about designs, it's about guidelines, but the reality is complete streets is more about a hierarchy. It's about the fact that we promote the automobile above pedestrians, above bicycles, above anyone else who's using the street, and we got to flip that around. We've got to flip it to the place where we prioritize pedestrians, we prioritize bicycles, so that everybody has access to the streets. But I think, also when we think about complete streets, I think this is probably more critical than what I think. I think it's more about what other people think about complete streets. Because to many of the communities that I represent, complete streets means gentrification, it means white privilege, and that's really the issue, that we as leaders, we've got to allow the public to understand what complete streets means, because complete streets really is an equity strategy. But the way that we've reflected it in too many neighborhoods is contrary to that.
Okay, I'd like to hear your answer to the same question, Shannon.
So to me, complete streets is something that that I voted for. I was a co-sponsor for the bill for city council as a councilwoman, because I realized that many of the people in my district and all over Baltimore City rely on transportation, but the transportation is not always reliable, and that's the problem that we're having. We want actually transportation that's reliable, that everyone can use, because when everyone can't use it, you don't have access to all opportunities. You don't have access to job opportunities. You don't have access to, even for seniors, to get to the doctor's office. And so for me, complete streets means that, one, we're going to actually invest in people and not cars. And so that way we're looking at the street designs of streets. We want to make sure that it's walkable, that even our sidewalks are walkable to be able to even get to the streets. We want to make sure that we have street designs that are for scooters, that are for walking, that are for public transportation. And to me, once we have that, that means that everyone will have access. That is how we start.
Dan?
Well, my view, complete streets very basically is the way cities should be structured, the way any healthy, vibrant urban environment is structured, where there's room for walking, biking, public transportation, deliveries, automobiles, parking, and all of these are fairly distributed, not with, as we have today, our main challenge is essentially we're a city designed for commuters. Most of our major arteries are designed for high-speed commutes in and out of the city. And I would simply point to the Hartford Road Corridor and the changes that have happened there, championed by Councilman Darcy. I used to live not far from there, and it was a 4-lane superhighway. Now, it's a much more friendly place where cars can still pass, but so can public transit. It's a much more pleasant place to walk and live, and it's essentially the kind of city we want to live in, and that's what Complete Streets is.
Now, you mentioned Ryan Dorsey, but he's also kind of taken some heat for those changes,
Yes, he
and
has.
is actually running for a contested seat right now. Would you
Certainly
be
is.
willing to kind of take on that same animosity from some of the residents, maybe?
You know, there was a time when I was Ryan's age, and I would have been as fiery and throwing some swings the same way he tends to be, but a lot of this is a matter of style. I think if you ask people who actually live around that Hartford Road corridor today, I would say overwhelmingly, people say, you know what, I was suspicious, I was concerned, but this is beautiful. You ask the business people who have more business because the streets are more walkable. It's an easy sell if you make it right, and if you listen to people. But there are gonna be people who will be upset, but frankly, a lot of those folks don't live here, and they won't be voting for Ryan because they live outside the city altogether.
Mr. Stokes?
Okay, so I think we have to get the complete streets done. It started some 10 years ago. I'm not sure if there's a vision before another 10 years go by. The complete streets started as a holistic look at our city grid, so that we were looking at our city grid differently than we've been looking at it. So it's not just about cars, it is about bikes, it is about the crosswalks, it is about how we lay out the sidewalks, the pavement area, about the traffic lights, how they should sync, whether or not we have these crazy red light cameras and speed cameras up. And it also should connect the trails, our greenways, which is 35 miles of greenway or more around an 80 mile circumference, so to speak. So we should be looking at this and getting back to exactly what the original vision was, tinkering with it with the communities. Again, this is a great time at the 10-year mark to re-engage the communities in this whole vision of what we wanted when we called this complete streets. And so I think we're at that point where we need to look at it once more with everyone, not to slow it down, but to move it forward, but to get it done now.
Lisa, you mentioned fighting for complete streets. May I make a comment?
Sure.
Because, you know, what I've learned, you know, in my short time on the council, that it's a big difference between co-sponsoring a bill and actually fighting for that bill. And while Councilman Dorsey obviously was the chief sponsor or introduced the complete streets model, I found myself in many instances standing with them, especially in the community, because it was difficult taking a piece of legislation to a community that really didn't understand complete streets. And oftentimes, you don't see the work that happens behind the scenes where people expend political capital that really doesn't bring any benefit to them, but really is because the legislation or the project really benefits the community. And if we're not willing to, in the communities that really don't understand complete streets, and really complete streets has been an enemy to them, quote unquote, because of the way it's been rolled out, then we really can't champion it for the city of Baltimore.
Thanks. All right, for this next question, we are going to start with Councilwoman Sneed. To combat climate change, there's currently a bill in front of the DC Council requiring transportation dollars be spent on projects that shift people away from driving alone. Would you pursue similar legislation? What would you propose?
I actually would. Again, this goes back to what we need to push for in Baltimore City and fully funding the complete streets manual and making sure that not only are we centered around less vehicles, that we are investing in people. And that's the way, when we look at our buses, actually making sure that they are good for our good for Baltimore City when you're talking about fumes and exhaust. We want, to me, smart transit. You want less pollutants in the air. You want to make sure that the buses are safe, that they're clean, that they're healthy for everyone to ride, and that's what we want to see in Baltimore City.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, I think I say yes, understanding that we have a very long way to go. I mean, currently, only 19% of Baltimore gets to work by public transit. The best performing city in the country is New York City at just over 50%, and New York City is a very transit-friendly place. Really, by necessity, most people are forced to ride the subway. Our challenge is that, number one, we don't control the bus system. You know, we're a city that simply does not control our own destiny. We have, our bus system is controlled by a state agency that has plenty of people who are sympathetic to us, but are not accountable to any elected official in the city. And that simply makes us unique to most functioning cities, and it's why we don't have, why that percentage is not going to move until we get a regional transit authority, and that I think is really important. I also think fundamentally we don't have a sense of urgency. There wasn't a sense of urgency back when we lost the red line. I fought for that very hard when I was Assistant Deputy Mayor for Operations, and to be honest, there were more people complaining about construction impacts than there were saying we need to get this $3 billion project off the ground.
Okay, so is your plan kind of not so much making a concerted effort around climate change, but more taking back power in Baltimore City, like taking the power out of the hands of?
Well, I think if
just
we're going
for clarity.
to combat climate change, we need someone to be accountable for it. And right now we have a city hall that's fundamentally not accountable for this number one thing. We can buy electric vehicles for the city fleet, that's something. But to get more people on the bus, which is frankly our number one task, if we're going to combat climate change, it's getting people out of cars and onto the bus. The only way we're going to do that is with direct authority over the bus system itself.
Okay. And
Okay,
Mr.
and I think that, I wasn't asked earlier about my 3 ideas or priorities, but I would like to say that one of my priorities would be to take parking and automobiles out of Midtown and downtown Baltimore. I think when we get to North Avenue, that's it. No more cars until that evening. It's over. You just get on the buses or get in other transit modes and you go into downtown, including to the other side of the water. I don't think we need downtowns. I don't think we need parking, cars downtown, or parking to help. Now, Baltimore obviously did not build its infrastructure to take the most advantage of being able to support the best use and need for climate change, or not having it impact us so hard. So anyway, my big idea is that we remove the vehicles in Midtown and downtown Baltimore.
Okay, I'm just wondering, before I go to get your answer, how many of you guys are on the same page as Mr. Stokes about maybe just removing the option of driving in a part of Baltimore?
I would absolutely agree with it. Listen, when we think about 83 and how many people actually are coming into the city from the county, it doesn't make any sense. We're making a way for them. What we need to do is make sure that the people that live here have access to public transportation or good transit. So my suggestion would be to, if you want to work down here, live here in Baltimore City. That's the best thing. That helps everyone.
And you can't make those kind of decisions in a vacuum. And so even if that's aspirational, you have to look at the entire city and make certain that we can say anything now, but make certain that we're also committed to make sure we put the resources to that actually happening.
Okay. And while we're on you, do you want to go ahead and answer the question?
Yeah, so I think Dan hit most of it as it relates to climate change. And we should have mandates. Without them, I think we move from administration to administration with little to nothing happening. But part of the mandate has to be implementing those things that really impact climate. And so it has gone far too long for Baltimore not to have a regional transit authority. We've got to have ownership. We've got to have the kind of say over our public transportation, or it will never happen. And in addition to that, we're not even doing the little things right. You know, before we even get to a transit, authority, we're not even doing protected bike lanes right. It is impossible to encourage people to use bikes if we don't invest in the bike lanes to the degree that they need to. It should not be 2020 where people are still getting on bike lanes and ending up in more hazardous situations than they did when they got into the bike lanes. And so if we're going to do it, we've got to do it right. We've got to do it comprehensively. We can't do half. And we do in Baltimore, we do too much of half and then move on to something else.
Is everyone on stage pretty much on board with the regional transit
Yeah.
authority, sounds like? Okay. Next question, and we will start with Mr. Sparaco. Why am I blanking on your name? I don't know.
It's a soft day.
Sparaco.
Just sing it.
Dan.
Dan, I got it right before the camera started rolling. Baltimore City Department of Transportation has a massive shortfall in funding, leading to crumbling infrastructure. At least $250 million in annual revenue is generated by automobiles in Baltimore City, but the Baltimore City Department of Transportation's operating budget is only $200 million. The remainder is spent by other agencies. Would you support a charter amendment to lockbox transportation and traffic enforcement revenues to the Department of Transportation expenditures?
Well, yes, in terms of traffic enforcement, speed and red light camera enforcement, that's an easy one. Yes, that should all be going directly to making streets safer. But this is a larger structural challenge that has to do with losing 30% of our state funding over the past 10 years. Back in 2013, 2014, we didn't take a gubernatorial election seriously enough, and we got Larry Hogan. And he proceeded to take a ton of money that was supposed to go to transit and put it into highways. So we're abandoned by our state government. And for the past 50 years, we've been abandoned. Cities like us have been abandoned by the federal government. Most of the roads that we drive today were built with federal funds that are no longer there. This is a fight that has to be expanded well beyond city government, and that starts with a vision worth investing in the first place.
Mr. Stokes?
No. I would no more dedicate funds to transportation than I would dedicate only water bills or water charges to the water department or vice versa. In other words, I would not limit what we could do in transportation according to the money that we collect, or limit what we need to do in the water division or wastewater division based on money collected. Both of those need a very much larger entity to draw from. In other words, today, because we've had such great need for infrastructure on the water side, the average water bill for average homeowners is astronomical. It's wrong, but it can only by law be paid for by the taxpayer dollar that is dedicated to that. I don't think that's a great idea. Also, there is just tens of millions of dollars that our federal legislators ought to be helping us to receive and bring into both the water as well as to transportation. So no, I don't think that we should have this limiting dedicated fund that disallows us to go beyond either system to get the right amount of money to work with both of those projects.
Okay.
Typically, I'm not supportive of locking any particular funds into a particular category, but in this case, yes, yes, yes. I don't think we realize the impact that transportation has on every aspect of the city. So an investment in transportation is not just an investment in the road, it's investment in community, it's investment in housing, it's investment in food access, it's an investment in public safety. It is so much of a general fund investment because it impacts so much. You can't even have sound economic development or community development without an investment in transportation. So we've got to do it. And so yes.
I'm going to say the same. Yes, I think about all the people in my community who can't afford cars. We have to invest in people and we have to invest in streets. It doesn't make sense that we won't allow people to have good quality transit in Baltimore City when we know the facts that people who don't have it cannot get to work, they can't pick the schools that they desire to go to, they can't get to doctor's appointments, food, they can't get to it. And so we are restricting so many of Baltimore City residents when we're saying, no, I don't want to invest in you. I don't want to invest in the infrastructure of Baltimore City. I bought my house on a main street, not thinking that I was going to be able to give up my car and I would be able to use public transportation because I had 2 or 3 buses coming through my street. When I became the councilwoman, what I found out real quickly is I cannot give up my car because I needed to go from meeting to meeting. So if I think about I have resources to own my car, what about the people who can't own their car? We're just totally taking them out, and that's not what we're supposed to do as leaders.
Thank you. And this question will start with you, Mr. Stokes.
Okay.
Often transportation projects that are proven to promote safety and access to people who walk, bike, and take transit face strong opposition from community members or council members. As council president, if data and engineering best practices support a decision, but your colleague in a district doesn't, what do you do?
Well, I think in almost every case, you go with what is right. And I think it's a misstatement, not by you, but it's a misstatement to think that people in communities won't go with what's right also. I think that if you take them the data, I think too often we try to take to the community what we've already decided. And by the way, everybody knows that you've already decided before you start telling them what it is you're going to do. And I think if you go to folk and you talk to them and show them data, show them information, get their input, and you can be the expert or you can bring an expert and they can talk the expert about what it is that is laid on the table. But the folk have to be able to respond to that, or in some cases, give their expert opinion because they're expert because they live there, because they walk those streets, because they bike those streets, because their kids play on those streets. So I've very rarely seen an instance where if you didn't have this conversation with the community, they didn't, at the end of the night, go along with you or tease it so that it's better than what it was when you first brought it in.
Mr. Pinkett?
So what I would do in the face of opposition is build a big jump. Take a lane of road away and give it back to the people who need it. If I see 8 lanes of traffic surrounding Druid Hill Park, we're going to take that too. If I see a plan that's not sufficient for North Avenue, which would be a grand street, then I shout about the inequity that represents in our city when you compare it to a Charles Street. When we talk about transportation, when we talk about complete streets, when we talk about these types of infrastructure, it's not, we are so far behind that some instances you can't be courteous and you can't be polite. This is, and I know the term says a street fight, it really is a street fight. Because if we don't implement these things, if we don't do these things, if we aren't convincing, if we aren't showing people the data, if we aren't really getting out there, we're handcuffing our city, and we are putting ourselves so far behind. And so as the council president, obviously we've got to work with everyone, but at some point you got to lead. And sometimes leading makes you make decisions that might not get you friends, but will be for the best impact of our communities.
So even when the editorials start rolling in from the Sun, or?
There's no editorial that can beat 200 people who live in Woodlawn who call you and email you. Well, you know what? I'm not really concerned about you in Woodlawn. I'm concerned about the citizens in Baltimore.
Sneed?
Yes, I'm going to say that we have to do what's right for the citizens of Baltimore City. So again, with the DAC, with the facts and the data, if that's what it supports, then we have to be champions for it because it ultimately benefits the people of Baltimore City. Our delegate, Robin Lewis, is one of the people who live in my community, and she's doing transit everything. She's given up her car, and what she's done is come back into the community to say, be a part of this process. Let's work together. Let's work out all the challenges. And she's not speaking from a place of, I have my car, but I want you to do X, Y, and Z. And so I've taken that and say, yes, that's exactly what we want to do. So we've been having meetings in our community, talking about transit, making it better for everyone, walking the community, bringing people on board. And so to me, that's how you make a difference for tough, challenging conversations. You lead by showing the example of, trust me. But when you already have those relationships, when you've already developed those relationships, you're able to tackle the hard conversations. And that's ultimately what we need to get through. We want to make sure that people know that we have their best interests, and we want to make sure that we ultimately are getting done what we need. And that's totally about the citizens of Baltimore City.
Well, I don't have any difficulty fighting for what I think is right and saying what I think is the truth. I do think you got to pick the right fights. So Carl's example about closing downtown to car traffic, that's probably not the first fight I would pick, but what I would do instead is talk about closing particular lanes, particular streets to car traffic so that only buses could travel down them, because I think that's more bang for the buck. So I do think you have to pick the right fights. But fundamentally, I think Shannon referred to this, it's about trust. You know, I started my career as a trial lawyer working for the Legal Aid Society, and I represented a lot of low-income tenants who were getting evicted in front of a lot of judges who wanted to evict them. And I had to get those judges I had to get them to maybe first. I had to shake their certainty about what they thought was the truth first. And that was fundamentally about making truthful statements about what was going on and earnest belief. And I think that goes a long way but fundamentally we have a Department of Transportation and a city government people don't trust, so you come to them with a big project and that's met with great suspicion, not without reason.
Okay, we will start over at that end again now. While Baltimoreans rely on transit every day, most elected officials and senior agency staff rarely use it. In fact, many of our city's traffic engineers, planners, and other agency staff don't live in the city at all. Will you pursue legislation requiring agency staff at agencies with a neighborhood focus like DOT, Rec and Parks, and Planning to live within the city?
I wouldn't require just one particular, I mean, if we're going to require one agency, then we should, no, I wouldn't require just one particular agency. Obviously, we would incentivize it to encourage people to use public transportation and the city council already has some incentives to encourage individuals to live in the city as it relates to tax incentives for home ownership and the like. But I wouldn't encourage I wouldn't make a mandate for the low-level staff to live in the city.
Ms. Sneed?
So as the councilwoman of District 13, I put in a bill that required our top officials to live in the city just for that exact reason. I feel like if you're living here and you have some skin in the game, you'll be willing to do a little more or find out what are some of the barriers and challenges that are going on. And so while we couldn't demand that everyone live in Baltimore City, what we did do is make sure not only of the mayor's cabinet, but directors and anybody who report to directors actually live in the city, because it was already required that the mayor's cabinet live in the city. And so to me, yes, absolutely, but I would also encourage that we actually give incentives, essentially, instead of paying for people to come into Baltimore City to park, that we give them other options that they can get on they can get on a bus, they can use the scooters, or they can bike to work. And I think that makes a difference. Already in my office, we have, the majority of my staff actually do not have cars. And so one actually walks to work or scooters to work, and the other rides public transportation because she comes a little farther. And so that's what we want. That's what we want to see happen in all of Baltimore City. When we're actually using and thinking about what's good for Baltimore City, that's good for Baltimore City.
Dan?
Well, you know, I have to disagree with the tide on this is moving towards let's make sure everyone lives in the city. But the fact of the matter is this: if we require our senior leadership across the entirety of the city government to all live in the city, the end result will be that the senior leadership of the city will be predominantly white, predominantly young, and predominantly without children. Because those are the people who can bear the unique costs and risks of living in a city that cannot keep its streets safe, cannot properly fund and manage its school system, and does not run its transportation system. If you make this rule, I know them personally. There are experienced black professionals across the city who have made the rational choice that, you know what, I'm committed to this city, I'm committed to making it work, but I'm not gonna raise my children here. And you're losing a talent pool that we cannot afford to lose. What we need to do is fix the underlying reasons why so many people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s move just across the county line to raise their families. That's the real issue.
So I fundamentally don't believe what Dan just said. People who put themselves here will fix their school system. But let me go back to my own answer. I believe that cabinet officials and the fire and police should live here. We're the only city among big cities, not the only, but one of the very few, where fire and police do not live in the city in which they serve. They are emergency responders. They need to be as close as possible. 80% of our guys and gals are somewhere else. beyond city limits, beyond the state limits, Delaware, Pennsylvania, great many officers are living. They need to be in the city, just like Boston and Philadelphia and LA and Chicago, et cetera, New York City. So I do believe that our cabinet officials ought to live in this city and not at a post office box, as many of them currently do.
That I
So-
agree with.
Okay. And so is there anyone else who kind of disagrees with Dan saying that there are people who make choices to not live in the city because of those reasons, or?
Oh, I
just
don't
don't agree
disagree with. I think it's a factual statement that people, people make choices. You come into this city of Baltimore, and as you mature and you grow and you start having a family, then you make different choices. You have different priorities. And as a city, we are not doing at the rate that we need to make certain that the areas that are critical to people that make those choices, you've got to have education, you've got to have public safety, you got to have access to a variety of different resources, you've got to have a strong public transportation system. Those are the things that make people stay in cities. And right now we're failing. And so it's not that people want to make the choice to leave the city, we're forcing them to make that choice.
But I'm going to disagree. I don't think we're forcing them to leave the city. Here I am, married, raising my daughter, and I'm making the decision to live in Baltimore City. Everyone who says that they ultimately care about Baltimore City, we're all in this together. It shouldn't matter. You should live here. You absolutely should live here. If everyone sent their kids to public school, guess what? Public schools will be better. What about the ones, again, who don't have the choice to afford parochial schools? So that means it's okay to leave them hanging? I don't agree with that. If we're all in it together, we can all make a difference together. But I believe that it's the leadership and the past decisions that we've made that have caused some of the problems that we see today.
So we're talking about people who already live in the city that are now made a choice to leave. So they've made the commitment, they've made the investment, trusting that we as leaders will honor that investment and honor that commitment. And we have not done that.
Okay. All right.
I don't think it's equal. I'm sorry, could I just have 30 seconds?
Okay.
It's not equal. And by the way, as folk decide to leave, it hits a tipping point where what they're saying becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they leave, the less the value of property in the city goes down, the less taxes come in, the less we're able to support our schools or our police, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one huge thing. And by the way, we're in a divided city, and it is absolutely true that there are hundreds of people who have decided to stay in the city, who are living a good life, who have safe communities, who have great schools, who are having places they can shop. It exists in the city currently. It just doesn't exist in every neighborhood of our city.
Okay. All right, we'll move on to the next question with Councilwoman Sneed. Cities and states across the county are attempting to attack the affordable housing crisis by simultaneously implementing affordability requirements and reducing barriers to affordable development. Delegate Vaughn Stewart has introduced legislation like this at the state level called the, quote, Homes for All package. Would you support legislation that introduced affordability requirements while eliminated barriers to affordable housing construction like parking requirements and single-family zoning?
Yes. And if you talk to some of the actual developers who are doing some of these projects, they will tell you that half the parking spaces they're not going to use. And if they're not going to use the parking spaces, here's the opportunity to get more people into good housing, affordable housing, and in good neighborhoods. So we should absolutely consider it because it doesn't make sense. We have to remove these policies that just don't make sense, that are not adding up. For some things, we just have to have common sense to sit down at the table to work stuff out like this. And if we are able to get more people with affordable housing, we absolutely should do it. As the next city council president, I would love to introduce something like that to get that done and work with the people, the developers here that are actually working on these projects. We have to bring everyone to the table.
Dan?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I mean, I'm a firm yes on that. A good carrot and stick approach. You said you must include affordable units. If you do, we will accelerate the approvals you need in order to build your project. I think that's, states across the country have done that. States that have a tighter housing market than we do have. California has done it. That's an easy one, and that would start incentivizing investment in neighborhoods that aren't getting it. So I think the barrier here is a development system that is essentially, that begins and ends at the Board of Estimates and a handful of downtown interests that decide where most development goes. And we have a fundamentally ossified lack of an entrepreneurial spirit in our development ecosystem. There are people such as Seawall in Remington that have single-handedly transformed a neighborhood, but that could be happening in multiple neighborhoods across the city, and it isn't. And because we're not only are we not pursuing policies like this, if it gets introduced, a long list of naysayers will start whining about why it's a bad idea.
I think it's a great idea. Dan mentioned Seawall. Seawall has done most of its housing without government subsidy. They're just conscientious. I think that those type of developments should go forward, but I also believe that the city ought to stop giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to developers who are not conscientious, who will not build affordable housing, who we had to fight around Harbor East and whatever that point is called down at Sagamore. But we had to fight over those issues because they refuse, even though they were getting $300, $400, $500, $800 million of taxpayer money, they refused affordable housing. So I think we have to take that money, some of it, quite a bit of it, if not most of it, and subsidize and incentivize those affordable housing developers that we have in the city.
Councilman Pinkett.
So I agree with all three of the candidates. They're right on. That's an easy one. But I think also in our city, if I could add, we need visionary leadership. We need leadership that sees what others consider a problem and turn it into a way to solve some of our most pressing issues. The city has over 16,000 vacant properties. That is an opportunity that is being wasted. And one thing this city doesn't do that we should be doing is we have all these individuals who receive Section 8 vouchers. That voucher should not be paying somebody else's mortgage. It should be paying the recipient's mortgage. That we need by now to be monetizing Section 8 vouchers so that people have the ability to purchase a home for themselves and thereby building equity that can be passed down to generations. We aren't looking for the win-win-win in situations when we have valuable resources. We've got to have that kind of vision, I think, to really address the affordable housing issue in our city.
Councilwoman Sneed.
I was going to say, is it the same question?
she started.
I started, but I was going to piggyback off it and say, and we had a bill, source of income bill, that would allow us to break up some of the concentrated poverty in our neighborhoods. And so that's a good example if, and it's currently at the state level now, that here's an idea where we can actually do affordable housing. If people can live there, people should be able to afford, people should be able to live anywhere they can afford, wherever their voucher allows them to do, to have access to, again, public transportation, food access, and bills like that allow that. And we voted for it on the city council just last year.
Okay, yeah, thank you. All right, Dan, we'll start with you for this next question. Baltimore City is far behind their goal of making our streets safe and accessible for people with disabilities. This can be especially challenging for people with disabilities who rely on public transportation. How will you legislatively pursue both compliance with our city's ADA mandates and work to improve the accessibility of our transit system?
Well, step one, to sound like a broken record, is we need more control over our transit system in order to do that. But I just had a conversation with the woman who's in a wheelchair about this very issue at a forum about a regional transit system, because this person says, we need control of our transit system so I, in a wheelchair, am better taken care of. Short term, we need to start, we need to look at our footways. The footways division at the Department of Transportation is kind of in the back of the room, and there's 12,000 complaints about broken sidewalks across the city. We need to make priorities. What we need is a vision that lays out where are the important corridors for people to make it on the sidewalk, on wheels. And we're not doing that now. We're simply taking it on a complaint basis, and it's a catch as catch can, and it's fairly random. It's very difficult, and you won't find a streets vision similar to the protected bike lane master plan vision. There's no similar vision like that for ADA compliance. And simply creating that would put us way ahead of where we are today.
So I think that we can go back to what we spoke about earlier, which is the complete streets, which would help us greatly in envisioning this. As a matter of fact, much of it is already there. If we would just take it to the next level, as I said, we're starting on it 10 years ago. Who knows when we'll finish it, but it needs to get finished because that is a particular part of it to make sure that we are compliant, that we do have the footways, that we do have the byways, and they're laid down properly, and that we do have folk attuned. My colleague mentioned footways, and he's absolutely right. But those places don't usually get enough attention, enough resources, enough money, enough accountability, look-see, that is, so that we know that where it was yesterday, it is moving forward and will be where it should be tomorrow.
I had an opportunity to meet the same woman that Dan referenced, a woman who was confined to a wheelchair. And she said something to me that was most poignant. She said that while the lack of the use of her legs has disabled her, the lack of accessible public transportation has crippled her. And some things aren't just about legislation and aren't about policy. It's really about will. And until we have the will to make certain that the budget reflects to do what we should already be doing, this should not even be a question or issue. There should be a complete analysis done immediately, and we should fix and make certain that the streets, our sidewalks, are handicap accessible, and that should happen day one.
Okay. Councilwoman Sneed.
I'm going to take a different approach to this because when we know that DOT, Department of Transportation, is not fully funded, and we know that they need more money. We know that there are open positions. You mentioned it earlier. We need people in those positions to address some of the stuff that's going on. And when we talk about equity, we should be looking at who got the last street pavement? How much street pavement is going on in Roland Park? What has it been in East and West Baltimore? I think when you look at it through an equity lens, it brings a whole nother dynamic. It will open up eyes, but we need people in those positions, and that's what we currently don't have. We don't have people in those positions. So how can we expect to do or get anything done differently if we're not hiring the people to take a look at it? We already have grants on the books inside of DOT, and you know what the state is saying? We're not giving you any more money until you use the grants that you have on the books. We have some of the money there, but we have to have the people in the positions to do exactly that, their jobs. We need people in those positions, the bottom line. As the next city council president, I'm going to make sure that not only are we funding it, but we get the right people in to actually take a look at doing their jobs in addressing the issue that we have.
So are you saying that you would allocate more funds so that those people could be paid, or how would you kind of address this?
Some of the funds are already there. We have to, right now, we can't hire anybody right now to actually come and work for the Department of Transportation because we're at a crossroads. Until we get a new mayor until we get to election, that's when we're going to get people who are going to be interested in coming. We hear it all the time as council members. We have open positions, but people are not willing. They don't know the future. So until we get through this race, I think that's when we'll actually have people that are willing to come to Baltimore City and know that they won't be fired in 9 months or 6 months.
Okay. All right, this question will begin with Mr. Stokes.
Okay.
Many employers state in job postings, quote, must have reliable transportation, which translates to, if you take the MTA, we're not hiring you. Would you consider pursuing legislation that prevents employers from requiring access to personal automobile as a condition of employment?
Sure, of course. But we've also got to back that up Again, we've all agreed to a regional transportation system, and the sooner we get working on that and talking with our colleagues from around the counties and the state to sit down and make this work, we can also do some things now. Again, I think we may have already talked about the circulator operates downtown and on the other side of the water, and we know that the people on East and Northwest Baltimore also could use a circulator, where folk are taking children to daycare, getting on another form of transportation, taking kids to school, and then getting on a third form of transportation and paying each of the 3 times to then take themselves to work. It doesn't make sense, and absolutely should not be a requirement, but we also have to make sure. When Amazon came in, this is the craziest thing. It took 2 hours to get to Amazon, and Amazon didn't think to bring a bus. MTA didn't think to bring a bus. The city hired a bus to take folk back and forth to work. That didn't make sense. It still doesn't make sense to think about it today. So we have to work in collaboration with the other folk and make it happen in a way that works for them. But the simple answer is, of course, I would not require any employer to force someone to get a car before they could be hired.
Okay. What about you, Councilman?
You're right,
Pinkett?
and that should no way be a requirement of employment. But we've got to support. We understand the limitations of our transportation system and limitations of our public transportation system. So we've got to put our money where our mouth is, and sometimes that means making certain that there are shuttles and other types of access that are available. When you think about even the jobs that are at BWI, we've got connectors that get people from the city to those employment centers. And so part of a sound economic development strategy, part of a sound workforce development strategy, part of a sound transportation strategy makes an assessment of where our employment centers are and finds out what the gaps are. And so as council president, that would be part of my role to make certain that the agencies are finding out where those gaps and making certain that there's connections so that people, are connected to employment.
Thank you.
No way. We should remove all barriers that we possibly can remove from people's lives. As the councilwoman, that's all that I've been doing, is try to remove barriers off the book to help the people in Baltimore City. And I'm also going to say it's time to lean in and stop duplicating so many systems in Baltimore City. And I say that in reference to, I've been on the bus in East Baltimore, and what I realized, if I'm going to the train station, I'm on the bus, I'll see a Hopkins shuttle, and I'm like, it just came from the same way. Imagine what we could do if we broke this up. If all the universities could actually go out, because the circulator doesn't come to East Baltimore. I'm pretty sure it doesn't come to parts of West Baltimore.
Never seen it.
Right, and so therefore, think about what we could do if we could use University of Maryland shuttle to cover West Baltimore. Think about what you could do if you could use Hopkins shuttle in East Baltimore, and then have the circulator, and then have a great public transit system. Those are all the things that I say we have to think outside the box about this, and that's how you help out all citizens in Baltimore City. That's how you take away the barriers to make sure we don't even have to ask you that question in reference to do you have a car, because we know we have a great transit system here in Baltimore City.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great transit system is the real answer. I'm more than happy to tell employers, don't do that. There's already a great deal of people who do take the bus to get to work. They don't always get there on time, but a lot of employers are relying on employees who do take the bus. So I would rather see on a case-by-case basis what employers are doing that and why are they doing it. But we have to get a little more creative about getting people to work, because simply forcing people to use a bus system we acknowledge doesn't work, and more importantly, attempting to overcome structural barriers. I mean, look, the two major things that have defined this city are housing policy and transportation policy over the past 100 years. And both of those policies in this city have been motivated by racism. So the neighborhoods that are having the hardest time getting to work on public transport are the most racially isolated neighborhoods. We need a vision to overcome that and reconnect those neighborhoods so that the bus gets them to work on time. And in the very short term, I got news. I'd get rid of the circulator altogether and invest in Uber, invest in car shares, invest in jitneys to get people to work immediately tomorrow.
Okay. All right, before we get to our last question, I'm going to take some time to double back and ask some of you the questions that I maybe asked one person, give you the other ones of you guys an opportunity to ask, if that's okay with everybody. Still about a minute for a response, and I will go with you, Councilwoman Sneed. Let's talk about changes that you'd make to the office. In prior councils, legislation has often been championed by individual council people, and committee assignments by the council president could effectively kill ideas before they even had an opportunity to be heard. What would that process look like in your council?
I have actually had my bills not be heard because whatever reason, because at the time the council president didn't think my bill deserved a hearing, or I've experienced from other colleagues that I thought was a good bill that I supported, have it die in committee. Under my leadership, I'm going to make sure that whether I agree with it or not, that every bill deserves a hearing. I even signed on to Councilman Ryan Dorsey's bill in reference to his charter amendment. I don't necessarily totally agree with his bill, but I think it should get a hearing, as well as Councilman Bill Henry's bill in reference to totally making the district smaller. I feel like districts like mine, where I live, my neighborhood, if you put us in a neighborhood with a Canton and a Federal Hill, we will totally get lost. We won't have good representation. So I believe that every bill under my leadership, whether I agree with you or not, I'm going to make sure your bills get heard. And I'm also going to make sure that I empower my council members to take the lead on just certain areas. I've said it before. Dr. Bullock has a degree in planning. Ryan Dorsey has a background in transit. And Councilman Z. Cohen has a interest in education as an educator. I'm going to empower them to make sure that we do really our diligence in Baltimore City to get those areas taken care of.
Mr.
Yes, I've had a bill put in limbo also, shelved in the drawer, and never saw the light of day. It would never happen under my administration either. Each council member represents a constituency, and each constituency deserves a hearing, the light of day of a bill that was put in by their council person on their behalf. Every bill is put in not singularly by anyone, but really on behalf of a constituency that brings that to them. And so I would always make sure that every bill could be heard and would be heard.
Did you answer the question?
No. As I was listening to Councilwoman Sneed, I was thinking about myself having about 15 years of professional experience in economic development, and somehow I'm not on the Economic Development Committee, but we'll save that for another time. I think in addition, all the comments were right. I think in addition, as council president, I would create an office and provide the resources for us to do a deep analysis on all of the issues and all of the pieces of legislation. I think, unfortunately, the current structure is so council president dominant that the council persons really rely on advocates and activists and institutions really to get the research and even the fiscal analysis that's necessary for pieces of legislation. I think that would empower our legislation if we had that staff in place on the council level available to everyone.
Okay. Dan, what role do you see the council playing in shaping city transportation system and policy?
Well, overall, what I think the system we have right now is an unaccountable mayor and a very weak city council. What we need is a strong CEO mayor with authority and a well-resourced city council that is able to make policy and hold that mayor accountable. You know, the challenges that we have is that there's so many urgent, immediate challenges that we have as a city. Look, the next mayor is going to have an almost impossible job, and they're going to be forced to put out fires on a day-to-day basis. The bottom line is that the city council's level of responsibility is different, and that's a good thing. The legislators, and I look to the Kerwin Commission at the General Assembly, we need 3 or 4 of those for housing, for transportation, for education funding. the legislator's in a position to think on a very long-term basis. I look at the Complete Streets Bill championed by Bikemore. That's something that happened in the council because the council has the time to consider it. Now, if only the council had resources to consider things properly, we could really get things done, and that's what I'm proposing.
We will go with, did everybody get a chance to answer that one?
I don't think I did.
Go ahead.
Right. Can you repeat the question one more time? though?
Sure. What role do you see the council playing in shaping city transportation system and policy?
Yeah, we have a big role. The good thing is we already almost have a blueprint out there. And so it's going to take actually the mayor and the council making sure that it's actually funded. And so the council is going to, as well as residents who live here in Baltimore City, it's going to take a heavy lift, but and a deep dive for us to get this done. But I know that it's us. We can do it. We're fighters. We're fighting for the people. I'm fighting for the people. So I'm definitely going to be, no matter what happens, on the mayor to make sure that people have access to all opportunities and resources in Baltimore City, and that's the way to do it.
Yeah, I think what my colleagues have already said in terms of their role is crucial. I think a lot of it is executive branch, but I think I don't want to use the term cobbling together, but since I've already said it, cobbling together the plan, the resources that Brother Pinkett said, and just making sure that we invite in, again, council people should represent that larger constituency out there. They sent us down there to represent their 80,000, 90,000, whatever that number is. And so we shouldn't go in there on a project as big as all transportation, doing it just ourselves, just in our hearings. But we should really make that into a round table, fuller discussion that allows part of the community to own committees themselves and to work hand in glove with the legislative body to then come up with good policy and good planning that the council obviously could be the only one to actually vote on it, but I think it should go that way so that the council does not have this myopic view of what they think is best for.
Okay.
And if I can add to that, I think that in addition, we've got to make certain that we have a competent director of Department of Transportation, and we've got a good one now, and as the council president, we need to make certain whoever's the mayor that our director remains in place.
Okay. All right, this is the question that I was able to ask you, Mr. Stokes, but I'd like to hear the rest of your answers as well. Baltimore has many neighborhoods where over a third of residents of working age aren't in the labor force. Of those who do have jobs, many endure commute times 45 minutes or longer one way. Children in neighborhoods with those characteristics are likely to born into poverty and face long odds of escaping it. What's your legislative agenda to reduce commute times and increase access to jobs for Baltimore's neighborhoods that most lack it? And we'll start with you, Mr. Pinkett.
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenging one in that, I mean, we've all talked about a regional transportation authority. And so, I mean, and that's long-term. Our transportation system is broken. And so I know that I answered some of it in reference to, people's ability to get to employment centers. We've really got to do an analysis of, what are the gaps in providing, public transportation, providing access, and be real about addressing those issues. Right now, our system is so hampered that we might have to cobble together, a system that really gets people to the places where they need to. But that's going to take investment. It's going to take time. But we're, as it relates to transportation, we are so far behind that we've really got to make some significant investments.
Councilwoman Sneed.
So I would actually like to see that we just get rid of people paying for our horrible transit system. Like, just allow people to get on the bus, and that way it will speed up the buses and people can start to get to work a little bit earlier. The second thing is to make sure that we have a transit a bus that goes from east to west Baltimore, some type of rapid bus, because right now we don't have that. Even when I think about jobs that we have on the ports and you have to be there to be on that boat at 6 a.m. in the morning, folks waking up at 3 and 4 just to get up to East Baltimore, it doesn't make any sense. The third thing that I think that I know that would implement is making sure that we actually, because people can still bike to work, and so we have to come up with a bike master plan as well. So it's up to you to just go ahead and get on that bike. But those are the 3 things that I would like to see as city council president.
Dan?
Well, the situation you described, and if you look at a map at the neighborhoods with the longest commute times, you're looking at a map of economic apartheid. And that's a situation that, as I said, has been created by a century of housing and transportation policy. We've talked a lot about complete streets. That's a set of principles, but we really have no transportation vision today in Baltimore City. We do not have a transit vision, and we do not have a roadway vision. And in my view, the vision that we need would attack that apartheid situation and would undo and reweave a city that was torn apart from the end of World War II through the 50s and the 60s by urban renewal, the highway to nowhere. MLK to the west side of downtown, the 83 on the east side of downtown. We have a series of barriers that have walled in exactly the neighborhoods that have these long commute times, and an investment and infrastructure vision will tear down all of those barriers and reweave these neighborhoods and reintegrate them into the economic fabric of the city and the region.
And did you have anything that you wanted to add this go-round?
I don't think anything to add to what my colleagues have said. I'm pretty good where I am.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right, so this is the last question of the night, and we're going to start with you, Councilman Pinkett.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome. After each candidate answers this question, we'll come back and give you each a minute for closing statements. So here's your question. Given what you've heard tonight, what do you think makes you the best candidate to advance access to transportation for the next 4 years?
I think that what makes me the best candidate is that when I came onto the council in 2016, transportation was not even on my radar. If you would have asked me about economic development, public safety, education, workforce development, I'd been right on it. But what I learned is that there's an intersection between transportation and all of those things. And if we don't get the transportation piece right, then we can't impact all those other areas. That took growth, that took maturity. I would have never thought that, 3 years later, I'm sitting on a panel with People for Bikes, or, going to conferences for Rails to Trails. I've shown growth in 3 years in the area of transportation, to a place where I'm not a Ryan Dorsey. I don't know if I ever become a Councilman Ryan Dorsey. I don't know if I want to be I don't know if I want to be a Councilman Ryan Dorsey. But I consider myself now a leader as it relates to transportation, and in a unique space as a black male in the transportation field. So I think that equips me to be the council president.
Councilwoman Sneed?
For me, I would say that coming in knowing that I'm going to be this transit person, I'm going to give up my car, that's still my goal. I still want to be able to give up my car, because I want to make sure that everyone has access to everything that they need. And so if that continuously is my goal at the top, then I'll know I'll continue to serve everybody in Baltimore City. And that's ultimately what we want to do. We want to make sure that all our residents thrive in Baltimore City. We want to make sure that we have access to food and supermarkets in our communities. We want to make sure that our students are able to pick schools based on their needs and wants, and not because they can't make it to the school. I think that will totally make a difference in what we see in Baltimore City. And you're going to need a leader to make sure that we champion those exact things. We talk about getting crime down. We talk about helping our students put education first. These are all the things that I've been fighting for already. So I know that as the next city council president, those things are at the top of my list.
Well, Lisa, I could list off a few qualifications. When I was Assistant Deputy Mayor for Operations, I fought a very hard and lonely and ultimately losing battle in favor of the Red Line. against a lot of very powerful people inside City Hall and outside of it who did not want that project to happen. Also, at the same time, I was vice chair of the Mayor's Bicycle Commission, fighting very hard to get bike infrastructure built in places where people didn't want it, and there was always a lot of complaining. But the real reason I think I'm well situated to take this job on is that I'm here to talk about the system. I'm here to talk about the way we deliver projects, and I'm talking about the absence of a vision for where this city is going to be in terms of transportation in 2030. Everyone on this stage we're all good people here, but we don't need good people in a failed system. We need to take apart the system we have and rebuild it from scratch. And to be honest, I'm the only person on the stage that's proposing to do that.
So I think it's my consensus building ability and my business sense. When I came back into city council after being out for 15 years, and the mayor said, we're gonna close 14 rec centers and 10 swimming pools, I said, why would you do that? And she said, because we don't have any money. And I said, show me the books. I'm pretty good with the books. Let me look at them. And I found out that there had been no audits of any books for 46 years. 46 years. And I said, that doesn't make sense. Short story, I said to my colleagues on the council at that time, we're going to audit all the books for performance and financials, and we're going to find out where our money is. And guess what? They voted against that. I actually lost the bill in city council because they said, we don't want to see what's under the covers. And I worked my off to make sure that people who didn't like it, didn't like me, that we put it together, that I just spent days and nights and 3 years working everybody until we all got to see and showed them what it was obvious. And I went and talked to their constituents to say, don't you want this also? My point of that is that I am consistent and I will stay on what is right for our city. The city is so broken right now that I will stay on it.
Thank you. Okay, we have gotten through all of our questions tonight, and now you guys all get 1 more minute, though, to give your closing statements, and we'll begin with Councilwoman Sneed.
Okay. Thank you all for having me here tonight. I just know that in Baltimore City, we need someone that's going to have vision and bring the city together. And I'm the person that's doing it. I have the most support out of all of my, I have the most support. I have my colleagues from the 1st District supporting me, the 2nd District, the 3rd District, and even the 8th District and the 10th District. And you need those type of supports when you're talking about a leadership position, because you're going to be able, as my colleagues say, wrangle all of those personalities together. And so when you have relationships based on trust and respect, those hard conversations that we're talking about that we're going to have to make sure that we have, we'll know that we're able to get everything done that we need in Baltimore City. And I'm not talking about just blinking eyes and doing it, but actually getting down and doing the work of it. I'm the one who has put in strong pieces of legislation from making sure that we support complete streets, making sure that we have residents that are actually living in Baltimore City. Those are the things that are going to make a difference, and that's why I'm the right one to be the city council president.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, I thank you all for watching at home. Stay safe, stay well. You know, when I moved here over a decade ago, I moved from New York City, and I hadn't owned a car in over a decade. And to me, it made perfect sense to go to my new job as an attorney on the 1st floor of City Hall on the bus. And I lived in Bel Air Edison, and I got on the M15 bus, and I rode it down Bel Air Road and Gay Street. And I got to the office, and my colleagues in the office were like, "You took the bus?" They were very surprised. But it wasn't just my colleagues who were very surprised. Everyone on the bus was very surprised, and I learned that it was not done, that some white dude in a suit on the way to City Hall rides the bus down Gay Street. I do things that people don't normally do. And I hear all the time, well, we don't do it like that in Baltimore. And I just think that's bullcrap. And we are in a position where we need to do very different than what we've been doing. And that's why I'm running.
And I'm the guy who stays in the gap consistently, constantly, and people can see that. So when one big property owner in Harbor East said, you know, we don't want to a red line stop in Harbor East because we don't want black people there. Now, he didn't say the word black people, but he might as well have said it, just like the CNN reporter said what she said. We knew she was talking about black people. And I'm the guy who, when they were building in Harbor East, and they said, we don't want any affordable housing, I said, well, I don't think you should get the money. And when my, not friend, but when they said over again, off of 95, where they wanted to spend $800 million with no affordable housing and no demand that workers would come from the city, I said no. I stood in the gap. I stayed up all night. I let the cameras continue to roll because I'm the guy who stands in the gap for our citizens, and I will continue to stand in the gap, and that's why I think I'm the guy who should be downtown.
Councilman Pinkett?
So a couple years ago, when I was a little bit less ambitious, I sat on a panel in Indianapolis with some other mayors around the nation, and the question was asked to me if I had to name our bike share program, what would I name it? And I don't know if it was inspiration or just thought of the city of Baltimore. My answer was connect. And at that time, I thought about, okay, connecting people to resources, connecting people, connecting communities, connecting people to education. But really, for me, I think it was just a little bit deeper than that. One of the greatest issues in our city is that we aren't connected. We aren't connected in so many ways. And it used to be a time when we couldn't touch one another. We couldn't be connected. But now we have the freedom to go wherever we want in the city, and we still have barriers and segregation throughout our city. That I feel deeply about that. And I think any leader for our city in this next generation is going to have to be someone who connects and restores and builds up and heals some of the broken connections of this city. And I'm the person to do that.
Right. Thank you very much, you guys. On behalf of Bikemore in Action, Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition, and the Real News Network, thank you to the candidates for the office of City Council President who joined us tonight and shared their vision for transportation in the city. Remember to vote in the primary on Tuesday, 28th, April 28th, if we are allowed to. You can find information on the candidates and how to register to vote at www.ibikeivote.com. Wash your hands. Don't touch your faces. Thank you. Have a good night.
Order an absentee ballot.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands. All right. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hate this.
Last time I saw you was at Will's in Will's kitchen a few weeks ago. Will, what's